Hi, and welcome back to Democracy Cracks. In this mini-series, we examine the fractures in our democratic systems and what we need to do to heal them. If you've been with me since the beginning, you know that we talked about trust and what happens when it fades, about disillusionment, polarization, and political participation changing shape. And we framed all of this around one key point: that democracy doesn't need to be thrown away, but maybe rather carefully recalibrated. But let's be honest, even if there are some signs of hope, democracy is under real pressure, from within and from the outside. And with it, the EU's values, security, independence, freedom, and prosperity. If this is really a crossroads moment, then our final question is clear. What needs fixing now? And not in 10 years or after the next crisis. Now. In the final episode of this mini-series, we'll look at some urgent measures that could help repair the cracks in our democratic systems. Let's dig in, this time with rebuilding in mind. From the research and from everything we've discussed so far, 3 levels of change really stand out. First, checks and balances need to be protected actively and not symbolically. Checks and balances are the basic safety system of democracy. They're what prevent power from concentrating in one place. In its 2025 Rule of Law review, Liberties, together with more than 40 other civil society organizations, showed that many EU member states have either failed to protect or have actively undermined this accountability mechanism. And this isn't confined to 1 or 2 problem countries. It happens all across Europe. What I am referring to is fast-track legislative procedures that are increasingly overused and which limit parliamentary scrutiny, reduce debate, and make decisions harder to contest. But there are also weak or purely formal public consultations where citizens and civil society are often invited in only after decisions have already been made. Executive decrees and emergency procedures have also become a normalized way of governing in several countries, bypassing ordinary legislative processes. Lastly, independent authorities are another pressure point. Some member states still lack fully established national human rights institutions. In others, this body exists on paper, but face chronic underfunding, weak mandates, or political interference. So the repair here is not to invent new institutions. It's to use, defend, and enforce the ones we already have, and to stop treating institutional safeguards as optional when they become inconvenient. And the EU is not powerless. It should use the tools it already has. Since 2022, freezing over 30 billion euros in funds to Hungary over systemic rule of law breaches has shown that enforcement is possible. It doesn't replace political will, but it does raise the cost of dismantling democratic safeguards. Second, make accountability visible and not just functional. Some basics really are non-negotiable. Democracies don't just need accountability to exist somewhere in the background. They need to see it working. Across many member states, the problems look surprisingly similar. Anti-corruption rules exist, but they're weakly enforced. Transparency is patchy. Whistleblowers are still left exposed. And again, the issue isn't a lack of principles. It's enforcement. Clear conflict of interest rules. Lobbying registers that actually mean something. Protection for people who speak up. Prosecutors who have the independence and the resources to do their job. Take Romania. For a while, its independent anti-corruption prosecutor went after some very high-level cases like MPs or mayors. That changed behavior, and it showed that enforcement doesn't have to be symbolic. But unfortunately, there were later government attempts to water down these anti-corruption laws. Third, stop overloading democracy without maintaining it. Over the past decades, we have asked democratic systems to do more and more. But at the same time, we have neglected the basic maintenance work, civic education and media literacy. Take Finland this time. Media literacy is built into education at all levels, helping citizens better recognize misinformation. From early childhood education, students learn how media works, how to analyze content, how to interpret messages critically, and how to create media of their own. As a result, Finland consistently ranks among the least vulnerable to disinformation in Europe. But there is something else we need to acknowledge. Even if we fixed all of this tomorrow, democracy wouldn't suddenly become smooth or conflict-free. And that's exactly the point Ophélie makes.
But I think that we need to accept that we're going through a process that by definition is going to be imperfect. I think we, especially in the West, we like to believe our systems to be the best possible things we could do with what we had. It might have been true for a while, but the thing with human organization, whatever that is, democracy included, makes it imperfect by nature. And the question is, how much are we willing to try and take into account at a certain moment with what we know, with what we've identified, with how ready society is on some topics? Understanding at the same time that this means that maybe in 20, 50, 70 years' time, we need to make the system evolve again because we actually realize that what we built was not great when it came to this part.
What I find important in what Ophélie is saying is that it forces us to drop a tempting illusion. The idea that there is a final version of democracy we just haven't reached yet. So the question is more about how to make democracies resilient. How can they live through crises, shocks, and disagreement without sliding into paralysis or taking authoritarian shortcuts? Economic shocks, pandemics, wars, climate change. Clearly, we can't avoid all of this. But democracies can absorb pressure better. They can adapt and keep going without turning against their own principles. This brings me to a more fundamental question, one that I might have been circling around throughout the last 5 episodes. Are our democracies producing too many losers? People who feel they never win, never benefit, and never get hurt? And how much of this is actually rooted in deeper inequalities? We've already talked about the links between inequality and participation. But there is also a persistent gap between laws or policy intentions and what people experience in their daily lives. And resilience becomes impossible if large parts of society consistently feel left behind. That's where the image of losers matters. Not in the sense that everybody can win all the time, but in the sense that some people feel they never win at all. And this is exactly where Ophélie pushes the conversation beyond technical fixes.
The problem with the reforms is what I call reforms at the margins. That is, we could be changing that and we could be improving this. And then we could be changing this element for this other element. But for me, it's a little bit like trying to put a bandage on a wooden leg, because what we really need to do is to address big issues, interconnected issues, political honesty, political trust, relationship between citizens and the people who run them, run countries in which they live. All of that needs to be re-questioned, because part of those tensions come from the fact of having categories of the population who keep on being unheard.
What Ophélie is getting at is that resilience can't be built on cosmetic change. If democratic systems keep producing the same results, the same inequalities, then on paper stability won't be enough in practice. So when we talk about resilience, we also have to talk about equality as a basic condition for democracy to work. The European Institute for Gender Equality puts it very clearly. Equality means that people's rights and opportunities shouldn't depend on who they are or where they come from. Democracies are not automatically more equal, but they are arguably better positioned than other systems to address inequality. By design, they require broader social and political coalitions, negotiation, and compromise. And two things matter here. First, equality and non-discrimination can't be add-on. They have to be built into policies from the start, what is often called mainstreaming. When equality is considered early on, policies tend to work better and for more people. But that's not enough. Treating everyone the same often just reproduces existing gaps. That's why positive actions also matters. Targeted measures that correct structural disadvantages and make equal rights translate into equal opportunities. And this connects directly to economic inequality. Proposals like minimum income schemes or universal access to healthcare and education, they are not just social policies. They are democratic repairs. So adaptation has to happen over time by addressing the structural conditions that fuel exclusion and resentment in the first place. That longer-term perspective is something Heather talked about from a place of cautious hope.
There's also another hope I have, which could perhaps help with this, which is institutions. It's actually really well-designed, independent, credible institutions that maintain not only democracy, that's why Donald Trump and others attack courts, central banks, and so on, because they know how important those institutions are to maintaining a check on their power and maintaining separation of powers and checks and balances and so on. So having institutions that are able to prevent dictatorship and prevent a slide into authoritarianism, they're really important. But also institutions can take a longer term view than individual politicians or individual political parties. And also institutions at local level, the way that civil society can maintain a vibrant links between people across different parts of society, allowing people to meet and to find common cause and how much they have in common with their neighbors and with other parts of society, rather than being atomized and thinking the only people I agree with and the only people I trust are the ones on my explosive Twitter feed.
What really comes through for me is just how important institutions still are. And when I say institutions, I don't mean governments or elected politicians. I mean the rules, bodies, and organizations that are meant to outlast electoral cycles and to put limits on power. When they are well-designed and genuinely independent, these institutions can do something that day-to-day politics often can't. They can take a longer view. They can hold steady through shocks. Courts, central banks, scientific bodies, all of these help keep democracy on its feet when everything else feels unstable. But it's not only about big national institutions. Closer to home, it's often local institutions, civil society organizations, or even community spaces that matter most because they are the places where people actually meet. In the end, resilience is about whether people still feel democracy is meant for them. And institutions matter, but they can't do it alone. So institutions alone cannot keep democracy resilient. And there is a temptation, especially in moments of crisis, to look for a single lever: better leaders, better structures, better communication. Don't get me wrong, all of that matters. But the evidence tells us something more complex. Political trust is not built in one direction, and it can't be fixed from the top down either. It's earned, reinforced, and sometimes repaired from both sides. This is something Daniela explains very clearly.
So how can we increase, of what are the determinants of political trust? So there is bottom up and top down. So bottom up would mean that it is, for example, important that the citizens or people in general do not only trust institutions, but also trust each other. For example, there is a lot of evidence that shows that if people trust their fellow citizens, then they have also higher levels of trust into political parties, into politicians, political institutions. And that is this bottom-up approach that if, for example, also the citizens share common norms and values, if they share the same ideas, then they have higher levels of trust. And then, on the other hand, of course, you have this top-down. If the system works, if I'm happy with how the system works, if I see that the performance of the system is very good, politically, but also economically, then I trust the system.
What she's describing is really a two-way relationship. And here, many small but concrete reforms can help repair trust from the top down. OECD data shows, for example, that improving daily interactions with public institutions can make a real difference. Things like how easy is it to find information, or how responsibly personal data is used. On more complex policy issues, trust also could be improved if decisions are clearly evidence-based and if governments balance the needs of different generations. But how do we repair the trust we have in one another? Decades of research on social capital tell us something very interesting. Trust doesn't grow out of slogans or participation exercises alone. It grows when people actually meet. This matters because people trust each other more when the system feels fair in real life, not just in how it's designed. Which brings us back to the importance of a healthy civic space. Funding matters, of course, we talked about it, but so do the conditions for safe and free expression without fear of repression. So this is where leadership comes in, right? Political leaders have a central role to play by being honest about trade-off, by thinking beyond the next election, and by defending democratic norms even when it's costly. But at the same time, responsibility doesn't stop at the top. Democracy also relies on citizens' civic responsibility. Yes, that means continuing to vote, participate, and organize. But how we do it is also key. Respecting the rights and freedoms of others, engaging in open and honest dialogue with the aim of solving common problems, and defending democratic norms, even when that, too, comes at a cost. That's why framing democracy as a shared responsibility matters so much. Not everything can be fixed by institutions, and not everything can be carried by citizens alone. Resilience lives in the interaction between the two, between systems that perform and people who stay invested, between leaders who act with integrity and societies that refuse indifference. After everything we've talked about, it might sound strange to end on hope, especially after spending so much time looking at democracy's cracks. But this is not about optimism as denial, or hope as something forced. What I have in mind is something more grounded than that. Because one thing that comes through very clearly, both from the research and from the people I spoke to, is that democracy rarely repairs all its cracks at once. It doesn't suddenly snap back into place everywhere at the same time. What we tend to see instead are pockets of resilience, small spaces where the cracks don't widen. Political scientists often talk about democratic renewal as something that starts close to the ground, through institutions becoming more trustworthy, participation becoming more meaningful, inequalities being taken seriously. And there is evidence behind this. Strong local participation, active civil society, and cooperation across communities are consistently linked to higher trust and engagement, even when national politics can feel polarized or stuck. And this is where I think it's important to be clear. The local and the European aren't opposites here. They are connected. What happens locally, in cities, in communities, associations, can scale up. And the EU, at its best, is one of the few political spaces where those local connections can cross borders rather than stop at them. And that's why Kelsey's perspective really resonated with me.
What gives me hope is actually being in the EU. It's like I believe in the European project. And I think despite the negativity in the rest of the world, it might actually be kind of like when your mom yells at you, so you start to do your tasks. I think that Europe really has the opportunity to be great and to be a leader not just in elections, but in terms of also leading in protecting the human rights and becoming a peace project. And I think we can do it. I really do. So genuinely, it just takes a little bit of willpower, but I believe in the citizens. I believe in the project. We just have to make it happen.
What she's pointing to is the idea that cooperation still exists across borders, languages, histories, and even when the global context is increasingly hostile. The European project is often criticized, and not without reason. But it's also one of the few political spaces where democratic standards and human rights and peace are the foundations. Yes, better enforcement and coherence are definitely needed. But in a world where those principles are under pressure, it still matters. If cracks don't disappear, where does hope actually come from? Is it something we expect from institutions and big political projects? Or is it something people build quietly through what they do every day?
It's very funny that you're asking me this question because I was thinking at lunch today that I didn't feel hopeless in a world that seems to be going into flames. And I was wondering why that is. And I think that when you are working for something that you think is deeply needed, whether that's more representation for underrepresented groups, whether that making sure that systems and institutions are more known to citizens so that they can decide accordingly, whether that's making people understand that the law is also something that they can change. So all of that being what I do on an everyday basis, I think that I've realized that there's a need for finding joy in small things that you're doing, because it sounds very heavy and very, heroic, but it's not. It's really just like you doing your very tiny little bit to make sure that this is going into the right direction. And I think that doing it in a way that gives you joy personally at the individual level, I think is very important, especially when at the global and like more collective level, it's not doing that great. But more importantly is the deep belief that you're not doing that on your own. No one's doing that on their own.
There is something really important in what Ophélie is saying. A lot of democratic work is not heroic. It doesn't make headlines. But research on civic engagement keeps pointing to the same thing. People stay committed when they feel part of something larger than themselves. And that may be one of the most realistic forms of hope we have right now. Not the idea that democracy will magically fix itself, but the knowledge that it's being held together every day in many places at once. In classrooms, in local councils, courts, civil society organizations, cross-border conversations that all keep going. So maybe hope for democracy doesn't come from grand breakthrough. Maybe it comes from these islands where people keep showing up, keep caring, and maybe most importantly, keep refusing indifference. And that's the end of Democracy Cracks. When we started this journey, we talked about political trust as the oxygen of democracy. Something you don't really notice when it's there. Something you assume will always be there. And something that becomes dangerous pretty quickly when it starts to run out. Over the episodes, we have peeled back quite a few layers. We've talked about disillusionment, polarization, participation, representation, about pressure, about cracks, and about what happens when a democratic system starts to feel less like a shared house and more like a place people no longer feel they belong to. But if there is one thing I really hope comes through, it's this. It is not too late. Not because democracy magically fixes itself. It doesn't. But because I really think it can still be repaired. Democracy was never meant to be easy, as Alex put it very clearly.
My main and most important point that we need to understand that democracy is kind of hard work and that it is demanding and that it is not natural.
But hard work doesn't mean giving up. And it shouldn't be confused with slowness or inefficiency as some kind of democratic virtue. Democracies survive when they are able to act decisively without giving up on accountability, rights, or inclusion. And that's the real challenge today. Illiberal regimes are organizing themselves with alarming speed and confidence. If democracies respond only with patience and procedures, they will lose. Agency really matters here. Democracy isn't something that just happens to us. It's something we do. It depends on institutions that are willing to hold the line. And it depends on citizens who refuse indifference. People who care enough to name problems clearly, to face structural failures honestly, and to push for change instead of drifting along. Some of you might hear that and think it sounds idealistic. Maybe it does. But I don't see idealism as naive. I see it as care. And caring is often when renewal actually starts. Before I close, I want to say thank you. This miniseries wouldn't exist without the people who helped bring it to life. Barbara Vanotti, Mariam Khotenashvili, Ilaria, Giustacchini, Florence Ferrando, and Nicolas Gadra. Thank you for your expertise, your generosity, and for pushing me to do better. And to all my ActEU colleagues and interviewers, Daniela Braun, Alexandros-Christos Gkotinakos, Alex Hopper, Alex Hartland, Michael Kading, Kelsey Beltz, Ophélie Omnes, and Heather Grab. Thank you for your time, your ideas, and your trust. And before we close for the last time, Democracy Cracks is produced by TEPSA as part of the Horizon Europe ActEU project. I'm Eva Ribera, Program Manager at TEPSA, and I'm the one behind these episodes. As usual, you'll find all the references used in this episode in the description. And mostly, thank you. Thank you for listening and for taking the time to engage with this mini-series. Let's finish on this. Democracy survives because enough people decide again and again that it's worth the effort.